everyone, welcome back. So for those of you who missed the session this morning, my name is Sheridan from Loughborough University. I'm the PI on the Luster project. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are very pleased to have John Sheridan from the National Archives here with us. So as most of you know by now, the National Archives is a project partner on the Luster project. So again, we are very grateful to them for supporting this project. So I'm going to hand over to John, who is going to present a very interesting talk. We have the slides already, which is great. It seems to be working. Yep, you're right. Yeah.
Perfect. So, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Sheridan. I'm the digital director at the National Archives. So that means that I'm responsible for a variety of digital services that we provide, and also for our work as a digital archive. And occasionally, I get to think big thoughts alongside, to be fair, a fair amount of bureaucracy that necessarily goes along with a job like mine. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to both think about and talk about and share some thoughts with you about the impact of artificial intelligence on digital archives. And I wanted to begin by giving you a statement that this presentation is human work. I've not done a slide like this before. It's not been necessary before. But this presentation was entirely prepared by a human being, me. ChatGPT was not involved. It didn't prompt me with any ideas. This is entirely work that I have produced, building on ideas produced by other human beings. And I'm reasonably confident of this because some of those ideas are so old that they predate not just ChatGPT, but predate modern computing. Now, we're moving into an era where well, certainly the first bit we'll continue to be able to do as human beings. We'll be able to say this is a statement of human work. It might become increasingly important for us to do that. The second statement, developing ideas solely produced by other human beings, quite rapidly, this is going to be quite hard to know. And I just wanted to have that reflection. And I thought, this was a bit of fun. So, statement of human work. And this is a big moment. It's been a while that we have had computing machines. And here's a fantastic image from the archive of Colossus. The first, large-scale electronic computer, for some definition of large scale. What we've witnessed, of course, is since the invention of microprocessors in the 50s and the exponential growth in computing power, exemplified by Moore's law, an exponential increase in computing capability. And for those of us like me, I've been passionate about computers for 40 years. It's like, finally, it's got really good. The sets of things that we can do, things that are kind of like half imagined, might be possible one day, seems to be being accomplished almost every day, every week. But it feels like, for those of us who are trying to think strategically about how we respond to the scale of technological advancement, particularly in artificial intelligence, that we are trying to navigate our way through a maelstrom. Both archives and records managers find ourselves ourselves dealing with consequences of technological innovation that we do not control. And the pace of advancement and the adoption, because these tools are just being used amongst us. I don't know who's currently using ChatGPT on the 7th floor of the Whitechapel building, but I bet someone is. So how on earth do we find our way through to think strategically and coherently about how to take advantage of the new capabilities that are amongst us, how to navigate some of the risks? And what's driving this, of course, is the massive evolution of, in particular, deep learning. And what we are coming to understand is, with massive deep learning models, the computers are gaining capabilities that are in some ways human-like. And this is a really profound moment. The computers can answer questions, generate content, generate images, generate, soon, books, films. Their capability isn't limited by human capability. And we are coming to terms with what this means for us, particularly those of us who are custodians of information. Now, not only is the pace of advancement very rapid, what's happening behind the scenes is also reasonably opaque. Very large amounts of money are being invested in the development of these new capabilities, but it is quite hard to know what information are these new models being trained on, and how are they being controlled and deployed? How are they arriving at some of the conclusions that they're arriving at, not least for good commercial competitive advantage reasons, but there is a lack of transparency that we also need to be very alive to. But I've been looking for, I suppose, when things are changing very rapidly, and where it's quite hard to see what the consequences might be, and this metaphor of trying to sail a small boat archive through a maelstrom, is a little bit of how it feels from my perspective. I've been looking for some lighthouses. Where are there some fixed points, some things that we can be really confident in to help us navigate our way through this? And I'm going to offer you 3 fixed points and track back from those in terms of how we might try and make some sense of what's happening. One is from maths, one is from economics, one is from law. Now, before going any further, I've also got some hunches. One of my hunches is, whilst things are going very quickly, what we're going to see with artificial intelligence writ large, and specifically with this application to digital archives, are 2 things. One is, some things are going to go incredibly quickly, and we're seeing that already. I read a journal article a week ago that talked about using deep networks to generate text of thoughts based on MRI scans. And oh wow, that's a thing. Who knew that was possible? That might throw up some issues, right? So there's a real sense of things moving very rapidly. Meanwhile, our economies, societies, and technology infrastructures are not that's changeable. And we already know from decades-long history of computing that bringing about profound change isn't just about what you can do because you have a new technology. It's a combination of people, process, and technology that you need to advance to bring about profound change. A lot of our systems are not going to be easily disrupted for all sorts of reasons. So whilst there is going to be very rapid advancement in some areas, there is also going to be, I expect, in a whole swathe of fields of activity, a much slower burn. And because of that, we'll have time to stop and think. So it's going to be one of the things that's difficult for us to understand, this, where things are going very quickly, but also spotting what's going more slowly and why. Now, into some lighthouses, some fixed points. So the mathematical one first, and full disclosure, I studied maths at university, and I've got a kind of special place in my heart for mathematical ideas. So I wondered, does anyone know what this equation is? James?
Is it entropy? And has it got anything to do with Claude Shannon?
It is, exactly. So this is a formula for a theorem, or a theory of information developed by Claude Shannon in the late 1940s through the lens of a theory of communication. Today we talk about it as information theory, and there's a couple of things that it's worth saying because the language is difficult. So the information that we talk about generally when we talk about archives and knowledge and information isn't the same as what Shannon means by information. And information entropy isn't the same as what physicists mean when talking about entropy. So information theory is about how you successfully communicate messages. And given some information, what your ability is to predict the next piece of information, the next bit of information, given what you have, level of certainty you might have. Now, because this is a mathematical theorem, it has a proof, right? So and this isn't the realm of like postmodernist relativism, right? This is we can be pretty confident in this because this is a mathematical theorem that has a concrete proof, and it also has some consequences. The consequence of what it means to encode something such that you can convey it. And that's what Shannon's really trying to understand, is that to successfully convey information, we find ourselves using redundancy. So to convey information, you need to convey some extra information in order for the receiver to know that what they have is what you sent. Now, of course, from a certain point of view, archives use redundancy all the time. It's redundancy is why we make multiple copies of records that we are preserving in digital archives, right? It's redundancy why we create checksums so that we can verify the copies we have or the thing that we thought we had, and digital preservation 101. Because of redundancy, and because redundancy is essential, mathematically essential to conveying information, we end up encoding more than we think whenever we encode anything about anything. And it turns out that even before we even before Shannon alighted on this theorem, we were dealing with the consequences of encoding more than we think, before we understood the maths. And here's a fantastic example of exactly that point, right? So in the 1840s, when Morse is coming up with Morse code, some letters have a longer sequence in the encoding than other letters, right? It is no accident that E is a dot, right? The most commonly occurring letter in the English language gets the shortest form of encoding in order to have an efficient way, using dots and dashes, of sending a message. One of the things that Shannon went on to explore was redundancy inherent in English language. Not all letters have the same frequency. The letter E is the most pervasive letter. If I give you a J, what's your chances of predicting what the next letter might be? And do all of the letters have the same probability? And the answer is, well, actually, if I give you a J, the chances of the next letter being an O, quite good. Or an A. The chances of it being a Z is basically minuscule, right? So I give you a J, you already now have some information about what the next letter might be. So what's a deep network fundamentally doing? Well, imagine this thing, right, scaled with all of the information we've been able to put into digital form on the internet, and imagine computers with the capability to start to exploit what is inherently encoded. You start to get a glimpse of how what we're seeing with large language models is directly a consequence of Shannon's great insights, a consequence of the redundancy that's inherent in any form of information encoding. We just have the means for realizing more of its value, as it happens in stupendous ways just now. But for me, I would say that Shannon's idea of information theory and understanding the concepts of information entropy, redundancy, and the consequences of the necessity of redundancy in order to communicate, in order to encode and communicate any form of information whatsoever, is probably one of the most important ideas for anyone involved in either information management or archiving to appreciate or understand. And we're getting a real taste of what the full implications of this are when you're dealing with very large quantities of information. But it's one lighthouse for trying to understand what's going on, and it's not going anywhere, right? The second lighthouse for trying to make some sense of what's happening, what it might mean for us, is some ideas from economics. This is a book that influenced me 15 years ago when I first read it, Yochai Benkler's The Wealth of Networks. Through this, Benkler introduced me to, I'm not an economist, so introduced me to the first time to the concept of transaction cost economics. Now, transaction cost economics goes all the way back to the pre-computer era. The economist Coase tries to figure out why some kinds of activity are done by big companies and some kinds of things are done by small companies. And he comes up with this economic theory based on transaction cost. Benkler extrapolates that to thinking about the impact of modern communication technology, and he's very interested in how it's come to be that things like Wikipedia can exist. And his argument is, well, it was impossible to organise tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of contributors in an intellectual endeavour in economic models prior to the internet, right? And there wasn't enough money in it to mean that it was economically feasible to employ the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people it would take to construct something like Wikipedia. But the internet has collapsed the transaction cost, allowing a new form of organization, and that new form of organization, exemplified by the Wikimedia Foundation, has allowed a very large number of people to work towards a shared goal of describing a very large portion of the sum total of human knowledge. And it's been made possible because of the collapse in the transaction cost. Something that couldn't have economically been realized has become realizable because the internet collapsed the transaction cost of organizing that human endeavor. Now, particularly in the case of Wikipedia, this has become stupendously important, because where is the data coming from that is teaching our large language models? Well, one of the main sources is this stupendous multilingual resource that the human beings have made due to the collapse in transaction cost for our ability to organize each other, organize and work together. The interesting question now then with the AIs is, what kinds of things have we just seen the transaction cost collapse around, and how is that going to shift or change forms of information production, knowledge production? Now, this point of changes in transaction cost is being very bound up with how technology has impacted things. So where processes in a way change the transaction cost around forms of human communication. One of the things that's led us to the world of digital heaps, Berners-Lee's invention of the web, allowing a global information infrastructure to be created by humans, a gateway to what we're now seeing with large language models. For archives, the collapse in transaction cost around two things: the ability to digitize our analog holdings and the ability to provide access on a global scale has transformed through the commercial exploitation of companies like Ancestry, has transformed who is using the archive and how they benefit from the resource that we hold. So our audience has expanded enormously, and the economics of digitization, because of a fundamental change in transaction cost, ultimately has allowed much of what was physically encoded to become digitally realizable. It's interesting to speculate to what extent, now that large-scale digital information can be exploited in new and novel ways, whether the economics of digitization shift again, this time in favor of companies hungry for digital content that they have yet to consume. So idea number two, transaction cost economics and thinking about transaction cost, another lighthouse, something we can look at and say, well, that's probably not going anywhere whilst much else around us is changing. The third area is that human beings will seek to govern and control, and we have mechanisms for how we make decisions in our societies through law. And you can see that there is going to be evolution in approaches to governance and regulation. The UK government published very recently its pro-innovation approach to AI regulation. The European Union has been developing its thinking very much around trying to create commercial liability. So it's like a legal design solution for controlling the consequences of this. There's lots of academic work and thinking about how approaching these sorts of problems, these regulatory problems, through the lens of data protection is at the limits of what can be accomplished through concepts of control and processing. So, for example, people arguing that we should be looking at not trying to govern these things through data governance, but govern these things through governing them, and a whole realm of literature around finding a voice for human rights in this landscape. The regulatory story is just beginning, and we can expect that to emerge too. So, what does all of this mean for digital archives, and in particular for the National Archives? And I'll speculate a little bit about what I think some of the consequences of this are for us. And I have in mind those three kind of lighthouses of Shannon's information theory. We encode more than we think. Transaction cost. The transaction cost has just collapsed in relation to a whole bunch of stuff that was really expensive or difficult to do, and it's now become comparatively cheap and easy, and that's going to continue. This is all going to be is already subject to regulation, and is going to continue to be subject to forms of regulation. And archives will need to navigate that. So I think digital archives are in a more powerful position than we might realize or intuit, because the collections that we have massive latent value. And the collapse in transaction cost means that an increasing amount of that latent value can be exploited. Moreover, that latent value is true not just of our digital and digitized holdings, but of our physical holdings too. And that latent value may be sufficient to fund further digitization. It's going to take us time to work through some of the exciting opportunities we have, particularly around managing information. We know that this new generation of AIs are very good at problems like content classification, organizing information. We know that they're good at things like generating textual content, summaries. We know they're good at things like transcribing things, describing images, a whole bunch of things that if you're in an archive, you're just like, oh, well, we've been just getting people to do that for a long time, and now we can start to augment our people with computers. It's going to take us time, though, but a lot of things around what it means to manage information, these technologies give us a big leg up. It's not clear how well the current generation of LLMs deal with the concept of time, and how temporally aware they are, particularly because of the changing nature of language and context over time. Like we as human beings know that the Middle Ages was a really different time, right? We intuit that in a very deep and profound way. It's not clear how well the LLMs understand just how different a place the past truly was, and therefore what kinds of questions they will be able to answer about the past. How much of that is somehow encoded. Genuinely evidential information records are going to remain very important. in an era where the ability to produce any form of information, the transaction cost has collapsed, knowing that this text is the law, or this is the record of the decision, is going to carry a premium in the context of it being relatively cheap and easy to produce or manufacture all kinds of things. And there's a question about should we try and privilege or double down using technological means our ability to assure or demonstrate the provenance of the information that we hold. Unpolluted sources, back to my opening point of this is a presentation produced by a human being. This is not a presentation that's been produced or contributed to by an AI. If you're training future models, knowing what has been produced by an AI and knowing what is the product of human work is likely to also be important. Slide, if I can get to it. Good custodianship, building practices for digital archives where we are demonstrably serving the public interest, that we are transparent about how the information we hold is being used and we are accountable is going to be important. Being circumspect about the risks of what information we put into the public domain, knowing that by putting information into the public domain, we make it available for consumption by new large language models is going to be important. I think pretty soon we're going to start building our own models of our own collections and governing their use. As the regulatory environment evolves and develops, I think we're going to need to continue to make the case for posterity in a context where most of everybody else's focus is going to be on protecting people now. And as part of that, I think we're going to need to make the case for legal privileges for digital archives, much as we have under data protection law with the concept of archiving in the public interest. I think we're going to need to make the case for a continuation of legal privileges for archives in a shifting regulatory context as our economies and societies come to terms with the radically different capabilities that this generation and the next generation of artificial intelligences have. That's everything that I have to say.
Right, thank you so much. Yes, thank you very much. And so we're running a little bit out of time, but perhaps we have time for again, one question, from people in the audience and one question from people online. James has a question.
John, when you say archives might have to build their own model, do you mean a large language model of their own collection? Can we look at ChatGPT purely based on their own collection?
Yes, exactly that. Because we won't be able to let anyone else do it. Yeah. And I think loads of people will find themselves in a similar place quite fast.
Okay. Quick question from me as well about responsible access, because you talked about being good custodian of the archives. So could you perhaps expand a little bit more about what does it mean to be responsible and also to be accountable as archivists?
So, I mean, there's two elements to this. There's complying with your legal obligations, which apply to archives as they apply to everyone else, but noting that we are given some special privileges at the moment, like archiving in the public interest as a legal basis for processing information about people. But there's also something which is about the ethical concerns and the professional ethics that archivists and information managers have. And that's about having regard to the consequences of what we make it possible to do using the information that we hold, both potential benefits, but also the potential harms. Now, I think archivists and information managers, and part of our USP in this arena is that we have, as professionals, the standing and the professional practices to potentially be trusted and good custodians in a landscape where there's plenty of other actors who rightly are going to be people may have doubts or concerns about in terms of their motivations, their ethics, and I mean, particularly corporations serve the interests of delivering shareholder value. You don't need to be a historian to know that, e.g., the East India Company was not a benevolent or benign corporate actor in serving those commercial interests. And again, there's a whole kind of body of critique around the decisions that corporations are making. Some of that will be subject to regulation, but I think there is a role for archivists and records managers based on our professional practices and ethics, where we should be seeking to continue to hold public trust through our professional practices.
Thank you so much. It's interesting because we talked about professional ethics this morning, so that's a nice connection here. Well, thank you again, John. That was great. Thank you.